In the last video, I started making 4 boxes that I'll be giving to family for Christmas. I got the box structure complete and added hinges to 2 of them, and if you want to see that video, then a link is in the description, and I'll put it at the end of this video as well. In this video, I'll finish the boxes by making the inside components. In 3 of the 4 boxes, I wanted to use walnut for the inside pieces. It'll complement the exterior trim quite nicely, and it'll give a nice contrast when the boxes are open. So to start, I resawed a piece of walnut and milled it to the final size, which I think was about 3/16 of an inch, which is roughly half of the box side width. And then I cut the pieces slightly long at the miter saw. For the 2 boxes without hinges, I wanted to add an internal walnut liner. Now this is typically done by mitering the joints so that once the pieces are fit to each side, they will naturally hold each other in place. And to trim the miters, I clamped a 45-degree ramp to my shooting board, which allows you to really dial in the perfect fit for each piece without going overboard and accidentally removing too much material quickly, like if you were to do this at a miter saw or a table saw. So I started at one side and just worked my way all the way around, and it was the first time using this method, and it worked flawlessly. I really enjoyed doing this. It's kind of satisfying when you can really dial in a joint absolutely perfectly. But if you haven't already made a shooting board yet, I highly recommend you do so, and they're just so incredibly handy with all kinds of attachments you can make, and you can get kind of crazy with it if you want. Even if you are primarily a power tool user, all you need is an old hand plane. And I'll post a link to the video I made making my shooting board at the end of this video. Next up, I wanted to make some half-lap dividers. Now the easiest way I've found to make these is to first make a non-through cut on a piece of scrap material. Then you can use that and some more scrap material to determine the fence placement that results in pieces that are an absolute perfect fit to the width of the saw kerf on that scrap material. Now you can make this, you can set your tolerance however you want. If you want a little bit loose or a little bit tight, it's all up to you. But anyway, once you have it dialed in, then you can rip a few pieces of divider stock, as I'll call it. And just like when cutting the trim, I recommend making a little bit more than what you need just in case you mess up later, which is entirely easy to do. I used a piece of scrap wood screwed to 2 miter gauges with a stop block to dial in a good snug fit for the divider material. And I wanted a 3x3 grid in the bottom of the box, so that meant 2 long pieces and 2 short pieces. Once the pieces were the appropriate length, I stacked them front to back and made a cut about 1 inch from the end, with the saw blade slightly higher than halfway of the height of the pieces. Then all of the pieces can be rotated 180 degrees and lined up with that same stop block again and cut once more. And at that point, the resulting grid kind of flows with the overall shape of the box. It's not an even 3x3 where everything is absolutely the same size, but it is symmetrical, and it does offer 4 different sizes in this particular situation. I wanted each box to have a removable tray, and my original intentions were to use some of the offcuts from making the boxes to make a curly maple tray for the curly maple box with hinges, and then the same thing for the spalted maple box with hinges. But I didn't have enough spalted maple scraps, so instead I just went with 1 curly maple tray for the curly maple box with hinges, and then 3 walnut trays for the other 3. Now to support the trays in the hinged boxes, I cut and glued a pair of blocks to the inside. Then it was on to sizing the walnut and curly maple for the tray sides. Now I resawed them for thickness at the table saw instead of the bandsaw because these were relatively small and the table saw leaves a much better surface. And then I cut them to length just the same way I did the divider pieces. Again, 2 short sides and 2 long side pieces for each box. So here's where I messed up a little bit. I wanted to use box joints for the tray joinery, but after cutting the short side pieces for one of the boxes, I really wasn't happy with the look. The problem is I'm using an alternating tooth angle blade, which doesn't leave a flat bottom groove. And I knew the angles would show up at the bottom of the cuts, but I didn't think it would look as bad as it did. I guess when I've done this previously on larger material, the proportions make the impact of the angles less significant, but because I'm using thin stock, it just stuck out like a sore thumb. So the solution obviously is a flat top grind blade, but I don't have one at the moment. So instead I chose to cut dovetails. And at the end of this video, I'll post a link to a previous video I made showing a foolproof process for cutting dovetails. So I won't go into great detail here, but basically transfer the thickness onto the tail and pin boards, cut the tails, chisel away the waste material of the tails, transfer the tail geometry to the pin board, cut the pins, use a coping saw or anything else to remove the bulk of the waste. Chisel away the waste to the marking line and test the joint. Now once one joint is cut, you repeat that 4 times to go all the way around the tray. With the joinery cut and the trays dry assembled, I was looking for a snug fit into the box. This will ensure that after gluing the tray all together, I can trim up each side and have a perfect tolerance fit. The trays will have a solid wood bottom panel, and to prevent damage from expansion and contraction, it needs to be free floating in a groove and not glued into place. So to make the groove, I used a single kerf cut at the table saw and positioned the fence so that all of the grooves will be visible on the tail boards and not the pin boards. And as soon as I started taking the first tray apart to cut the groove, I immediately got confused as to what side needs the groove. So to solve that and prevent any dumb errors on my part, I reassembled that tray and put blue tape on the outside and top surfaces of each piece. This way, when I cut the groove, I just need to make sure that the tape is up and out in relation to the table saw and the fence. And here you can see the groove exiting the tailboard, and this is easy to plug after assembly. For the bottom panels, I jointed some matching walnut and curly maple and resawed it at the bandsaw to about 1/8 of an inch thick. It was a little bit heavy of 1/8 of an inch. Now my plan was to have the jointed side face up in the tray and have the resawed face facing down, and to leave it somewhat rough on the bottom, just to give it a little bit more of a human-made feel rather than it looking like it was 100% manufactured. I rough cut the panels at the miter saw, trimmed them to the appropriate width at the table saw, and then used my shooting board to dial in the perfect length. Now the thickness of the panels was a tiny bit too thick, as I previously said, so I beveled the bottom side as needed to make them fit into the grooves. During assembly, I used a small paintbrush to apply the glue and made sure to stay a little bit closer towards the outside to hopefully direct the squeeze out toward the outside, and then verified everything was nice and square while in the clamps. Now, once the trays were dry, I sized some scrap pieces that will be lightly wedged into the tray bottom exit holes in the tailboards and glued them in place. Now, after trimming them flush with a handsaw, they pretty much disappeared, which was great. Finally, I used my smoothing plane to clean up the sides of the tray and sneak up on a perfect fit. Not too loose, but not tight at all. It should slowly drop into place with gravity. Now, wood does expand and contract, so that's something to take into consideration when fitting something like this, but I live in a pretty humid climate, so I expect this tray to, well, this whole project really, to shrink more than expand going forward. I didn't want to go crazy with the finish on these. It's definitely a less is more situation in my opinion. I wanted the natural look of the wood to do all of the talking, so on the inside of the boxes I used a coat of mineral oil, which will offer a tiny bit of protection, not much, but it really makes the grain come to life. So on the outside I built up a few coats of shellac, sanding with 220 grit before the last coat, and the outsides have a really nice silky smooth feel to them, and the insides have a natural you're holding an actual piece of wood kind of feel to them. But anyway, that's it for this video. So I'll post a couple related videos on the end screen that you might find of interest. Be sure to check those out. Thanks for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you guys on the next one.